In this lesson, we're going to look at the experience of being disabled. Being disabled is actually very common and is sometimes called the world's largest minority group. The WHO estimates that about 17% of the world population has some kind of disability. And the number of people with disabilities is increasing as the global population is getting older. The other important thing to understand about disability is it's actually a kind of a fluid boundary. Whereas we might like to think of people as either being disabled or able-bodied, the boundary between these two groups is actually much more fluid. And we can kind of think about this through the concept of what's called the temporarily able-bodied, right? That is kind of, most people with, who are able-bodied. And the point of putting the temporary in there is to let people, understand that anybody in the future can become disabled, right? And that if a person lives long enough, or lives into old age, the probability that they will be disabled in some way, have hearing loss, have vision loss, gets, quite considerable. So, in this lesson, we're going to have an overview of disability studies, talk about the stigma of being disabled, and then end with the idea of what's called the disability paradox. So, disability studies is a social science examination of disability that emerged in the 1990s. Up until this time, disability had really been something that had just been examined within the medical field. But in the 1990s, then it became be examined as, not just a medical issue, but also a social issue. So to understand the idea of disability studies, we can contrast two different models of disability. The medical model of disability with the social model of disability. And obviously, it's the social model of disability that disability studies is advocating. Okay, so what is the medical model of disability? So the medical model says that people's individual limitations are the cause of their problems that they experience because of their disability. Right? The idea here is that a person is suffering from some type of physical abnormality. Right? There's something about a person's body that is, abnormal or not, like normal people. Right? A person cannot hear, or a person cannot see, or a person cannot walk because they've had a spinal cord injury. And so in this model, disability is kind of understood as a personal tragedy, right? It's that person's problem, and it's kind of tragic in a way, and it leads people to feel sorry for that person. If only they weren't blind, or if only they could walk. And so the other idea in the medical model is that, how do you handle disability? How do you, in some sense, fix it? Well, you apply medicine to it, right? That you try to come up with medical treatments. You get ear implants that get people to hear better. You try to do surgery, right? If disability is understood as a medical problem, a personal medical problem, the solution then is to, have some type of medical care. So, how does the social model of disability contrast with this medical model? So, the main idea here is that the social model says that it's not just the physical limitations of disabled people that is causing their problems, but also the way that society is organized. Right? That it's not just a personal tragedy of somebody, an individual person, but that disability is a social issue, right? And a social problem. And that it's the way society is organized that is in some sense causing the limitations that a person who is disabled is experiencing. And so in this social model, it's really not just about a person's physical limitations, but it's about a person's relationship with, society in general and other people. And so in this way, disability really becomes something different. Disability is defined as an outcome of disabling barriers imposed by a social environment or a policy. And so therefore, the solution to disability is not just kind of some type of medical treatment, but rather a change in society, right? A social change, right? So that idea is that it's a social change that will reduce stigma or allow people to live their lives to the fullest, not just some type of medical change. And so really, it's a switch from kind of seeing it as a tragedy to kind of political activism. One way we can really see the importance of the social model is to make a distinction, and it's a distinction that the social model makes. It's a distinction between impairment and disability, right? And we're going to see that it's actually a very similar distinction to the distinction between disease and illness. Well, what are these two things then? So, impairment is the physical limitation that a person has, right? There's something about their body that impairs them, right? They are unable to see, they are unable to hear, they're unable to walk properly, right? To kind of give the classic examples, right? There's something about a person that they have a physical limitation, a physical impairment. In the social model, disability is something more than impairment. Disability is not just something wrong with a person's body, but rather disability is that a person is no longer able to live their life to their full potential because of the way that society is organized, right? A person who has an impairment is not just being limited by that impairment, but rather by the organization of society. Let me give an example. So let's imagine a person with an impairment, right? They are paraplegic. They have some type of spinal cord injury, and so therefore they cannot walk physically. They have that impairment. The social model says, look, the reason why they can't live a full life, right? They can't have a job, or they can't go to a restaurant, or they can't go see a movie in a movie theater, is not just because of their physical limitation, but because of the way society is organized, right? The restaurant doesn't have a ramp. The job is not making it possible for a person to work there, right? The movie cinema only has steps, right? And so the idea here is that now a person is unable to live, their life, not just because they can't walk, but also because of, the basic everyday organization of society, whether or not there is a ramp into a restaurant or not. And so here the idea is disability is something more than just a person's physical impairment. Disability has to do with a discriminatory society that is causing a person who has an impairment to have kind of problems in their everyday existence. So that really kind of sums up the difference between this kind of medical model of disability and the social model. The medical model viewing disability really in medicalized terms, seeing it as a physical problem, and the social model saying that it's not just an impairment, but it has to do with the organization of society. So what else can we say about the experience of being disabled? So one key part of the social experience of being disabled is stigma, right? And we heard about stigma in a previous lesson. So what can we say about it? And some of it is, what I'm going to say is, similar to what I talked about when I talked about stigma and the stigma of illness. So just like illness, disability can become a person's master status, right? It can become the most basic form of identity that a person has. They're no longer a lawyer. They are a blind person. They're no longer a mother. They are a person who's bound to a wheelchair, right? Their disability becomes the most essential and basic factor of who that person is. and it's how other people view them. And so, as it becomes their main form of identity, it really becomes a negative identity. Right? Why is this so? For a couple of reasons. First, disability can be seen as, what we have heard before, as a bodily abomination. Right? The idea here is that the bodies of disabled people are in some way abnormal or defective. Right? We have this stereotypical idea about how people's bodies are like. They can see, they can hear, they can walk. And if a person is disabled, then they do not conform to that stereotype that we have about people's bodies. Right? And so because of that, we see them as, defective or abnormal. The image here is then also almost of damaged goods, right? That a person is less than whole, right? They are broken, or they are not a full person, right? And also, in a weird way, there's also the stigma of disability comes from a kind of a fear of disability that people have, right? They see somebody who is disabled and they fear that they themselves may become like that in the future, right? That part of the stigma or negative feelings that we might have about a person in a wheelchair is that we ourselves may fear that, one day I might be in a wheelchair, and that scares people. And because it scares people, when they see somebody in a wheelchair or with some other disability, they have a negative reaction to that person. Right? They don't want to experience it. They don't want to see it. They would just prefer for that person to, kind of go away, so that they don't have to think about, the problems that they, might have in the future. Okay, so this is pretty kind of abstract. What are some examples of the stigma of disability? Right? So we can see a number of quotes that people with disability have in talking about, their experience. So this is the first one. This woman with rheumatoid arthritis, which is, a type of arthritis that is not just painful but kind of physically disfiguring. It makes your hands and feet and the other parts of your body kind of abnormally shaped. Right? She was interviewed for a newspaper, her local newspaper, and she was excited to, read the article that came out and for people to learn about her disability. But when she read the article, she found that she was described in this kind of very negative way as a person to be pitied, as a person who was kind of broken and, really kind of in a very negative light. And so she says, who would want to be friends with this type of person? Who would want to hang out with a person who is described in this way? And so really you see this, this idea of being kind of afflicted, or, being this kind of negative feeling of stigma that people with a disability have. We also see this idea of how people become required to give a performance of normality, right? That friends and family members try to get people to hide their disability, right? So this woman here, again, said, that her family members and friends would, try to tell her to cover up her hands, because they were unsightly, put blankets on her, right? And so again, it's trying to kind of conceal or hide the disability like a secret, and then therefore to kind of try to avoid the stigma. Here we can see the trouble that people have, particularly teenagers, in forming relationships and interacting with other people. Right. So here we have a description of this teenager, Paul Davis, and his kind of problems in dating, and he was finally able to kind of date a girl, and he picked her up, went to her house, but when the father found out that his daughter's date was blind, he would not allow his daughter to go out, right? And so, the essential quote here is, less than a whole man, right? So it's kind of seeing the disabled as kind of, not whole people, right? Kind of, broken or defective in some way. Right? And we see that, social exclusion is, essential part of the stigma of disability. Right? So another experience of a teenager, right? So that, when they became blind, they would, they lost a lot of their friends, and, people described them as a freak, and people didn't want to hang around them. And lastly, we see this idea of, self-imposed isolation, right? So this man in a wheelchair knows that, if he goes to an unfamiliar pub, people will stare and gawk at him, and so that it's better just to kind of hang around the places he knows, where he feels accepted and where he feels okay. And so we see here, this is, also an essential part of this social model of disability, right? That the negative experience that people are having who have a disability or have an impairment is not just from their physical limitation, but from the responses that they get from other people, right? The negative responses to stigma, right? And that's not part of their physical impairment. Rather, that's a response from society, right? I want to end this lesson on actually kind of a slightly positive note, and that is with the idea of the disability paradox. So people have done surveys of people with disability and asked them about their life happiness, estimated, how happy they are with their life, right? And given them the same questions that, the people who are temporarily able-bodied are asked. And what we find, or what has been found, is that people who are disabled have the same degree of life happiness than as people who are able-bodied. Even more so, there has been research on people who have had spinal cord injuries. Right, so people who have had their spinal cord severed, they are no longer able to walk. And what seems to happen is, while there is after the injury, there is a decrease in happiness, within about 5 years, the level of life happiness returns to normal. Right? And so the question is, how is this possible? Right? How is it possible for people to be just as happy who are disabled? Especially if you ask people who are able-bodied, what would they think about their life if they became disabled? Most people are incredibly fearful of it and have a very negative reaction to the idea of disability. And so the question is, how are people with a disability, how are they happy as everybody else when people are normally so fearful? So there's a couple ways to understand this. The first way is to think about people who are born with a disability, right? So somebody who is born blind or somebody who's born deaf. They have no other experience of the world to compare it against, right? They don't have any experience of vision or experience of hearing, and so they don't really understand it as something that they're missing out on, right? They don't understand it as some type of problem. And in fact, what they will say is the only real problem that they experience is the stigma or the reactions from other people from being blind or from being deaf, right? So the impairment itself is actually not something they, see as a negative thing, because they know no other, type of experience. What about people who become disabled, right? And they become blind or become deaf, or or can no longer walk. So research has found that there is this kind of trajectory, right? Whereas right after the injury, people are, depressed and have a negative experience. Within about 3 to 5 years, people will actually return to a normal state of happiness, right? And people learn to really adapt and to their new experiences, and can quickly return to kind of a normal state. Right? And we see this here in this quote here by Tom Shakespeare, who is a sociologist who himself became disabled, suffering a spinal cord injury. And so we see is people are pretty resilient, and they are able to kind of bounce back and make the most out of their life. And as he says, actually sometimes they can be driven to even greater achievements than before. So we see here in this lesson the experience of being disabled, the overview of disability studies, the stigma of being disabled, and then lastly the disability paradox.